Philip Castellani answered to no one on this earth except a 79-year-old woman in a wheelchair. His grandmother wanted one thing before her heart gave out: to see him married, so 4 families sent him 4 women, each one flawless on paper. Then, in front of all of them, Rosaria Castellani reached out and pulled a 5th into the line. The maid, 27 years old, head down, hands still damp from the stairs she'd been scrubbing an hour earlier. Winona Vance asked to be excused 3 times. His grandmother said no 3 times. Philip couldn't refuse her, so he made his own rules instead. 3 days each as mistress of the Castellani estate, and a way of scoring them that made 4 of those women laugh out loud. Nobody expected the maid to make it past the first morning. Nobody expected what she'd find. And nobody in that house, least of all Philip Castellani, expected to be the one who ended up being tested. If a story about someone nobody respected speaks to you, hit like so it reaches the person who needs it. Share it with a friend who's been underestimated their whole life. And subscribe, because there's a new one every week. Now let's go back to the morning. 5 women stood in that living room, and the one who was never supposed to be there at all. Philip stepped down from the final stair, and the entire room seemed to stop breathing. He didn't look at the 4 women the families had sent. He looked straight at his grandmother, who had just said no for the 3rd time, then turned toward the 5 women standing in a line before the fireplace. "All right," he said. "If you want me to choose a wife, then I'll choose one my way." No one answered. Rosaria placed both hands on the arms of her wheelchair and waited. "Each of you will take control of this estate for 3 days," Philip said. "Complete authority, the operating budget, the staff, the guest schedule, internal security. Your signature will carry the same weight as mine for exactly those 72 hours. Vivian Calloway was the first to react, tilting her head slightly as the corner of her mouth lifted. Isabel Renaud glanced at Margot Whitfield as though checking whether she had heard correctly. Only Sabrina Ferraro remained still, her eyes never leaving Philip. "During those 3 days," he continued, "I won't observe. I won't offer advice. I won't answer a single question. If you need someone to consult, then you've failed before you've even begun." Margot let out a small laugh, then fell silent when she realized no one else was laughing with her. "Then who will judge us?" Isabel asked. "You?" "No." Philip turned toward the housekeeper standing in the hallway doorway. "Mrs. Marsh." Helen Marsh entered, carrying a small wooden box with a narrow slot in its lid. She placed it on the table in the middle of the room without saying a word. 32 people work and live on these grounds," Philip said. "They'll judge you. Secret ballots. No names. The votes will be placed in this box and opened on the morning of the 4th day in front of everyone. Mrs. Marsh will keep the box. Nico will verify the count. No one is allowed to touch it, including me." This silence was different from the others. Isabel laughed first, a short sound of disbelief. Vivian joined her, louder. Margot covered her mouth, though her shoulders still shook. "You're serious, Philip?" Vivian asked. "You're going to let the maids decide who becomes your wife?" "I'm going to let the people who understand how this house functions decide who is capable of running it." "Those are 2 different things." "No," Philip said. "They're the same thing. You've simply never had to think about it." Vivian didn't retreat. She pointed toward the end of the line, where Winona Vance stood with both hands clasped tightly over her stomach, her eyes lowered to the carpet. "Then what about her? She works in this house. She eats with them, sleeps in the same quarters as they do, and has for 2 years. You call that a fair secret ballot? You've already handed her 32 votes before the game has even begun." Winona raised her head. She opened her mouth as though she meant to say something, then stopped. Philip looked at her for 3 seconds before turning back to Vivian. "You're right." Vivian leaned back slightly, satisfied. "So I'll add one condition," Philip said, "for Miss Vance alone. In addition to the secret ballot, every decision she signs during those 3 days will be reviewed in full. Every expense, every signature, every personnel change. Victor will compare everything against the ledgers. If even 1 cent is improperly spent, or if she makes a single decision she can't explain, she'll be disqualified immediately, regardless of the vote." The smile on Vivian's face slowly disappeared. "The other 4 of us won't be reviewed," she said carefully. "The other 4 of you don't live in this house." Victor Marchetti, who had stood beside the window from the beginning, gave a slight nod. "I'll handle that, sir." Winona didn't object. nor did she appear insulted. She merely dipped her head once, like someone who had just been given another duty, and for some reason Nico Barone frowned without understanding why. "There's one more thing," Philip said, and his voice dropped low enough that everyone in the room had to lean forward. "I don't need a wife who knows how to sit at the head of a dinner table. I can hire someone to do that. I need someone who understands that every signature made in this house comes down on the head of someone sleeping in the servants' quarters behind it. If you don't understand that, then your 3 days will pass very pleasantly, and I'll know exactly what I'm looking at." No one laughed anymore. Rosaria slowly raised one hand and turned the old ring on her fourth finger, saying nothing. Helen brought over a small porcelain bowl containing 5 pieces of paper, each folded into quarters. Philip told each woman to draw one. Isabel drew number 1. Vivian drew number 2. Margot drew number 3. Sabrina unfolded hers, looked at the number 4, then raised her eyes to Philip with something quick flashing through them. Not disappointment, but calculation. Winona was last. She didn't need to open hers. Only one folded paper remained in the bowl. "Number 5, Helen said for her. "Miss Vance will go last." Vivian settled the shawl back over her shoulders and spoke just loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Lucky you. By the time it's your turn, everything will already be decided, and no one will have to bother anymore." Winona lowered her head and answered very softly, and it was the first sentence she had spoken in that room since she had been pulled into the line. "Yes, miss. I hope so too." The rumor about what had happened in the drawing room reached the servants' quarters faster than Winona's footsteps did. When she pushed open the kitchen door, the staff lunch had already been laid out, and more than a dozen people seated there all looked up at once. "Good afternoon, future mistress of the house," one of the kitchen assistants said, drawing out the words. Laughter followed. "Don't forget it's your turn to scrub the second-floor corridor today, or does someone else do that for you now?" Winona set down the bucket of water and didn't answer. "Come on," someone else said, in a gentler voice that was no kinder. She didn't do anything. The old lady pushed her into it, so she had to stand there. Standing beside Judge Calloway's daughter, in her uniform. The laughter was louder this time. Helen Marsh entered through the pantry door and set the wooden box down on the counter hard enough to silence the entire kitchen. "Whoever just said that," she asked, "can repeat it for me now?" No one spoke. In 2 years, Miss Vance hasn't missed a single day, hasn't lost a single thing, and has never pushed her work onto anyone in this room. Helen looked around at them. "She didn't ask to be placed in that line. You know that better than anyone. Finish eating, then get back to work." The crowd dispersed. Winona picked up the bucket and walked into the corridor, and Helen let her go without saying anything more. That afternoon, Winona knocked on Rosaria's bedroom door for the 4th time. The old woman was seated beside the window with a leather-bound notebook open across her lap, and she didn't look surprised to see her. "I suppose you've come to ask to withdraw again." "Ma'am, I'm not suited for this." Winona remained in the doorway and didn't step inside. "The other 4 women have been trained for this since they were children. I don't even know how to speak to people like them. This morning I made the whole house laugh. If I withdraw now, things will still be easier for everyone." Rosaria closed the notebook. "Have you considered me? What I might think? I think you care for me. I'm more grateful for that than you know. But caring for someone doesn't mean placing them somewhere they don't belong." The old woman looked at her for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was no longer as gentle as before. "Do you think I brought you into this house because you're good at scrubbing floors?" Winona raised her eyes. "Ma'am?" Rosaria turned the old ring on her finger once, then opened the notebook again as though the question had never been spoken. 3 days, Winona. Go do your work." That same afternoon, in the ground floor study, the family's private physician closed his case and rose when Philip entered. He waited until the door had shut completely. "Her condition is worse this week than it was last month," he said. "I don't want to give you a number, but you'll ask, so I'll tell you now. About 6 months, perhaps less." Philip stood motionless beside the desk. He didn't ask him to repeat it, didn't demand another option, and didn't sit down. "Does she know?" "She knew before I did." The doctor picked up his case. "She asked me only one question, whether she would live long enough to see spring." After he left, Philip remained there for a while, then opened the door and called Nico inside. Nico shut the door behind him and placed 3 sheets of paper on the desk. "The shipment at dock number 4, he said. It was stopped exactly 40 minutes before unloading. The harbor police were already waiting there. It wasn't a random patrol. The second shipment 5 weeks ago was exactly the same, and the warehouse in Red Hook was sealed on Tuesday. Philip turned over each page. 3 months, 3 incidents. 4, if we count the license that was revoked in September. No one outside knows the unloading schedule 40 minutes in advance. That information exists only inside this house. Philip placed the final page down. I know. Then you also know I don't like this 3-day game. Nico rested one hand on the back of a chair. You've just opened the entire operating budget, the staff roster, and the internal security schedule to 5 women, 4 of whom you barely knew before this began. That's right. You say that as though it was deliberate. Philip didn't answer at once. He walked to the window and looked down into the courtyard, where 2 gardeners were raking leaves into a pile. For 3 days, each of them will control the exact things someone has been selling to the outside, he said. And during those 3 days, I won't be watching anyone. Everyone knows that. If someone in this house has been waiting for a door to open, I've just opened 5 of them at once. Nico was silent for a long moment. You're not looking for a wife, he said. You're setting a trap. I'm doing both. My grandmother has 6 months. Nico looked down at the 3 sheets on the desk, then back up at him. And what if the person isn't one of the 5 women? What if it's a member of the staff? Then you've just handed the keys to the house to 5 strangers. Isabelle Renault asked to switch turns that very evening, citing a previously booked flight she couldn't cancel. So the woman who stepped into the first 3 days was Vivian Calloway. At 6 o'clock on Monday morning, all 32 people present on the estate grounds were ordered to gather in the rear courtyard. It was November, and every breath hung like smoke before their faces as they stood there for 17 minutes before Vivian appeared. She walked slowly along the line, stopping in front of several people before returning to the head of the courtyard. Beginning this morning, she said, you will address me as Madam. Not Miss Calloway. Not Miss. Madam. No one answered. I didn't hear anything. A few scattered voices said yes. Vivian nodded in satisfaction and signaled for her private secretary to distribute a printed packet. 11 pages. Rules governing arrival and departure times, which passageways could be used inside the main house, who was permitted to speak before being addressed, and how much distance had to be maintained whenever guests were present. The final page contained a new duty schedule, with the morning shift beginning 40 minutes earlier than before. Helen Marsh read all 11 pages, folded them, and asked to speak privately. Vivian granted her exactly 3 minutes. This schedule requires 3 people to leave the servants' quarters at 4:20 in the morning, Helen said. 2 of them are elderly. Then they'll wake earlier. Miss Calloway. What I mean is that the furnace in the rear quarters is broken. Mrs. Marsh, Vivian said, and her voice was perfectly calm, without the slightest sharpness. I have 3 days. I don't intend to spend them hearing about a furnace. On the second day, Vivian summoned 2 people to the study. The first was a storeroom attendant, who had been reported for giving a curt answer when asked where a case of wine had been placed. The second was Dolores, a kitchen worker and single mother, whose 7-year-old daughter was staying with a cousin in Hicksville. The reason entered into both records was exactly the same, reduced to a single word: attitude. Dolores asked only once whether she could remain until the end of the week so she could receive the rest of her wages. Vivian signed the paper and pushed it across the desk. Accounting will pay you according to policy. You don't need to remain here for that. That afternoon, Vivian called in an installation company and had 4 additional cameras mounted along the corridor of the staff quarters, 2 at either end of the sleeping rooms and 2 beside the rear exit. When the technician asked whether she wanted cameras installed in the kitchen as well, she said no, the kitchen already had them. No one objected. All 32 people continued working, waking 40 minutes earlier, addressing her as Madam. And that evening, dinner in the kitchen was so quiet that the sound of a pot striking the sink could be heard clearly. The third day passed without incident. The main house was cleaner, meals were served more precisely on time, no one arrived late, and no one raised their voice. On the morning of the 4th day, Helen carried the wooden box into the drawing room and placed it on the table. Nico Barone cut the seal, and they opened it in front of everyone. All 32 ballots were read aloud, one by one. When the final ballot had been laid down, no one in the room spoke for quite some time. Vivian looked at the number, then at Philip, then back at the number again. "Has there been some mistake?" "No," Nico said. "I was seated here from beginning to end." Vivian rose. She didn't lose her composure, and that made the moment more uncomfortable than it would have been if she had become angry. "I made this house run more punctually than it ever has," she said. "In 3 days, I eliminated 2 unnecessary employees, standardized every procedure, and allowed no mistakes whatsoever. If that is the lowest score, then I'm afraid the problem doesn't lie with me." Helen was placing the ballots back inside the box. She didn't raise her head. "Yes, miss," more punctually. Vivian looked at her for a moment, then picked up her shawl and left the room. Her car passed through the gates before noon. The 3 remaining candidates had witnessed everything, and Margot Whitfield was the only one who said aloud what all 3 were thinking, that Vivian had approached the entire thing incorrectly, that a woman couldn't be judged by a duty schedule. Sabrina Ferraro offered no opinion. She merely asked Helen one very polite question, where the ballot box would be kept between each woman's turn, and Helen replied that it would remain inside the locked cabinet in the housekeeper's room, with 1 key kept by her and the duplicate held by Nico. Sabrina thanked her and asked nothing more. That afternoon, after everyone had dispersed, Winona went down to the storeroom to collect supplies and found Dolores packing several uniforms into a bag. The 2 women didn't say much to each other. Winona only asked whether she had a permanent mailing address, then wrote it down on the back of an old invoice. That evening, she knocked on Helen's door. She didn't mention her own approaching turn, didn't mention the ballots, and didn't mention Vivian. She only said that the old duty schedule was still preserved in the ledger, that the assistant kitchen position had never officially been reported to the main house as eliminated, and that if Helen recommended rehiring before the paperwork was transferred, no further approval would be required from anyone. Helen looked at her through the narrow opening of the door. "When did you think of this?" "When she asked to stay until the end of the week," Winona said, then wished her good night and returned to her room. 3 days later, Dolores's name appeared once again on the timesheet, and not one person in the main house noticed. Isabel Renault returned exactly as scheduled and entered her turn with an entirely different strategy. On the first morning, she didn't gather anyone in the rear courtyard. She went down to the kitchen at 9 o'clock, sat on the high stool beside the cutting table, as though she had been sitting there for years, and told Helen to invite each person in to meet her, one at a time, with no need to hurry. The first person emerged from the staff dining room holding a white envelope and wearing an expression no one could read. The second came out the same way. By noon, all 32 people had received one, and no one in the kitchen opened theirs in front of anyone else. "This isn't a bonus," Isabel told Helen when the 2 of them were alone in the room. "It's an apology. I've just reviewed the payroll records from the last 3 years. No one in this house has received a raise since last year." Helen rested one hand on the final envelope that had not yet been distributed. "What do you intend to do about that?" "I intend to correct it." That afternoon, Isabel held an all-staff meeting, lasting exactly 11 minutes, and announced that if she became mistress of the estate, everyone's wages would be doubled within 1 year. Insurance coverage would be extended to include immediate family members, and no one would ever again have to bear the cost of working beyond their scheduled hours. She meant every word. There was no performance in it, and several people applauded. On the second day, she summoned the entire security team to the drawing room and presented each man with a watch. Nico Barone accepted his, thanked her in a single sentence, then placed it in his desk drawer and never wore it. The third day passed peacefully. No one was dismissed, no one was reprimanded, and the staff meal that day included a dessert Isabel had ordered from outside. On the morning of the fourth day, the ballot box was opened, and the number read aloud made Isabel herself frown. It wasn't low, it wasn't high either. It sat precisely in the middle, calm in a way that was almost insulting. "I paid them more than anyone else ever has," she told Philip in the hallway, her voice still gentle but stripped of its earlier confidence. "I don't understand." Philip didn't answer. The answer was in the kitchen, in a sentence spoken by the oldest kitchen assistant in the house while she scrubbed a pot, unaware that anyone was standing in the doorway. "In 3 days she'll be gone, and in 3 days the money will be gone too, but the furnace will still be broken." Isabel's car left through the gates that afternoon, and Margot Whitfield began her turn the following morning by doing nothing for the first 2 hours, except walking through the rear quarters and asking each person's name. She remembered nearly all of them. By noon, She was in the kitchen with her sleeves rolled up, standing beside Helen and chopping onions. "Let me do this part for you, Auntie," she said, and Helen paused for half a second at the word auntie before allowing her to continue. Margot cooked alongside them throughout lunch that day. She asked one person about a grandchild who had just started high school, asked another about a painful knee, and when she learned that the furnace in the rear quarters had been broken for 3 weeks, she fell silent for a moment before saying she would look into it. That evening, she ate with the staff in the rear dining room instead of taking dinner in the main house. Someone told a joke, and she laughed genuinely, laughing so hard she had to put down her fork. The second day was warmer still. She brought pastries downstairs at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, sat on the rear steps with 3 young chambermaids, and took photographs with them. She took quite a few pictures over those 2 days, but no one paid attention because everyone took pictures. By the evening of the second day, people in the kitchen were already saying that if they had to choose, they would choose her. On the morning of the third day, a server carried a tray up the second-floor corridor and stopped outside the small sitting room because the door stood slightly open and a voice could be heard inside. Margot was on the telephone, and her voice was completely different, quick, clipped, and highly professional. "Keep the ones from the kitchen. That entire set is usable. Get rid of the garden shots. I look fat in them. Put the one of me sitting on the steps with the 3 young women first. That one is the best. No, post them after everything is over. If you post them now, it'll be obvious." The server stood still for about 3 seconds, then continued down the hall. By noon, everyone in the rear quarters knew. No one said anything to Margot. Dinner that evening proceeded as usual. Someone still told a joke, and Margot still laughed, but no one laughed with her. She noticed, though she didn't understand why, and she left the dining room earlier than she had on the previous 2 evenings. On the morning of the 4th day, Nico cut the seal for the 3rd time. Margot's score was higher than Isabel's, but far lower than she had expected. And when she heard the number, she gave a short laugh and said that 3 days was far too little time for anyone to truly understand her. No one argued with that. That afternoon, Helen took a sheet of paper, drew 3 lines across it by hand, wrote down the names of the 3 women who had completed their turns along with their scores, and pinned it to the kitchen notice board beside the duty schedule. She added no comment. Everyone passing through the kitchen that afternoon stopped to read it. Some read it twice, and no one took it down. Winona stopped as well, only once, while carrying clean linens to the 2nd floor. She studied the 3 numbers a little longer than the others had, then continued on her way. 2 turns remained, and hers would be the last. Sabrina Ferraro began her turn by never once appearing in the staff quarters. She didn't hold a staff meeting, didn't hand anything out, and didn't make a single promise. On the first morning, she sat in the accounting office from 7 o'clock, and by noon, she had finished reviewing 18 months of operating expenses. That afternoon, she summoned Helen and presented her with a list of 4 changes. All of them minor, all of them reasonable. 3 food suppliers would be consolidated into 1, so the estate could qualify for a volume discount. Laundry service would be reduced from 5 days a week to 3. Of 2 overlapping maintenance contracts, 1 would be terminated. Helen finished reading and couldn't find anything to object to. "You work quickly," she said. "I grew up in a house exactly like this one," Sabrina replied. "The only difference was that my family couldn't afford mistakes." The second day brought a dinner for 11 business partners from the construction division. Sabrina designed the entire seating plan, selected the wines, arranged the order of service, and even prepared a conversation script for each table. The evening proceeded without drifting a single minute from schedule. Not one glass was spilled, not one name was spoken incorrectly, and when one guest mentioned the situation at the Red Hook Harbor, the conversation was redirected so smoothly that the man himself never realized he had been guided away from it. Philip stood near the far end of the room for almost the entire evening and didn't have to intervene once. On the 3rd day, Sabrina closed the books and presented the final figure. Her operating costs over those 3 days were 22% lower than the average for the same period. If maintained for a full year, the savings would be enough to pay the salaries of 6 additional employees. The figure was laid out clearly on a single clean page, with her signature at the bottom and Victor Marchetti's verification signature beside it. 1 day earlier, in the accounting office, the 2 of them had sat together for exactly 15 minutes. Victor opened a file and pushed it across the desk. Sabrina read it, turned 1 page, then stopped. "This item," she said, "the Supplemental Medical Fund. It was discontinued in September. Discontinued or cancelled? Victor didn't answer that question. He only said the expense had not yet been entered under any category, and that if she wanted the final figure to appear clean, she should place it under operational optimization, because technically that was exactly what it was. Sabrina picked up her pen, paused for one very brief moment, then signed. Has anyone been informed? No one has asked. Then that's fine. She closed the file and rose, and Victor opened the door for her, and neither of them said another word. On the evening of the third day, Sabrina found Philip on the second-floor balcony. He was standing there alone, and she came to his side without touching him. Do you remember the summer when you were 17? She said. Your father made you sit at the adults' table for 3 hours. I was at the children's table, about 13 feet away, and I watched you for all 3 hours. Sabrina, I'm not telling old stories. I only want you to know that I've waited 20 years for you, Philip. She turned to look at him. And I'm not waiting another 3 days. Philip didn't answer. She didn't wait for him to. She went back inside, and he remained out there for a long time. On the morning of the 4th day, Nico cut the seal for the 4th time. All 32 ballots were read aloud, and when the final one was laid down, Sabrina's score was higher than half the combined total of the previous 3 women. It was the highest score so far, and not by a narrow margin. Helen wrote the number on the sheet posted on the kitchen notice board, on the 4th line, and this time someone in the kitchen whistled. Philip read Sabrina's 1-page report in the study that afternoon. Nico stood on the other side of the desk with his arms folded across his chest. You're going to decide now, aren't you? I'm going to finish reading first. You've finished. You've read it 3 times. Philip placed the page down. She's good, Nico. Not good in the way the other 3 were. She understands this house. I'm not saying she isn't good. Nico walked to the window, looked down into the courtyard, then turned back. I'm saying something else. Do you remember Calloway's turn? 4 people went to Mrs. Marsh to complain about the duty schedule. During Renault's turn, 2 people came to ask whether the money in the envelopes had to be reported for taxes. During Whitfield's turn, someone came to ask why she was taking photographs. 3 turns, and every time someone came to say something. And, this time, no one came at all. Nico pointed to the page on the desk. 3 days, 32 people, not a single word. Why was her turn the only one no one complained about? Philip looked at him. Because she didn't do anything for them to complain about. Or because she didn't do anything that touched them at all. Nico shrugged. Look again. In those 3 days, she didn't go down to the staff quarters once. People don't complain about someone they've never met. Philip picked up the page again. The figure of 22% sat on the 3rd line from the bottom, neat and precise, with 2 signatures beside it, and nothing anywhere on that page showed where the savings had come from. He read the line once more, then folded the paper and placed it in the drawer. There's 1 turn left, he said. It begins tomorrow morning. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Rosaria summoned Winona to her room. On the small table beside the window lay an old ring of brass keys, several of them darkened with age. She picked it up and placed it in Winona's palm. You've carried these keys for 2 years, she said. No one has ever given you permission to use them, that's all. Winona closed her hand around them and said nothing. Downstairs, the 3 women who had already completed their turns still hadn't left the estate. Isabel had returned the day before. Margot hadn't departed, and Vivienne had sent word that she would remain for several more days as a guest of the family, something no one was in a position to refuse. All 3 sat in the drawing room that morning with their coffee, in exactly the place where they could see the front door. And when Winona passed by, Vivienne spoke just loudly enough for her to hear. 72 hours, beginning now. Margot gave a quiet laugh. Winona didn't stop. She didn't go to the ground floor study, where all 4 women before her had begun. She walked straight through the rear door and down to the staff quarters. The first thing she did was walk the length of the sleeping corridor, opening every unlocked door and placing her hand against each heating pipe. Every one of them was cold. She continued to the mechanical room at the far end of the wing and opened the furnace panel. By 9 o'clock, she was seated in the records room with the maintenance files spread before her. The invoice was on page 14. A charge of $4,200 for replacing the heat exchanger in the staff quarters heating system, dated October 19th, marked paid in full and stamped completed. Winona read the date again, then opened the calendar on her telephone. 3 weeks had passed. She went back down to the mechanical room, photographed the old heat exchanger with its thick corrosion around the joint, then returned upstairs. She asked Helen only one question: whether anyone from the contracting company had come to the estate in October. Helen thought for a moment, then said that one man had come, stayed for less than 20 minutes, and she couldn't remember the company's name. "Did you sign for the work?" "No," Mr. Marchetti signed. Winona wrote that in a small notebook and said nothing more. By noon, she had moved on to the second file, the benefits section. She compared the August payroll with September and October, and it took her quite some time to find the difference, because it wasn't a deduction. It was a line that had disappeared entirely. The supplemental medical fund. It appeared on the August payroll. It was gone in September. There was no written notice, no meeting record, and no signature from anyone authorizing its termination. Winona went to find Helen for the second time. "Did you know the supplemental medical fund had been cut?" Helen looked up, and the expression on her face was answer enough. "When was it cut?" "September." "No one told me." Winona asked one more question, whether anyone on the estate depended on that fund regularly, and Helen remained silent for about 3 seconds before answering. That afternoon, Winona went to the western greenhouse to find Tomas Rayner, one of the gardeners. He was tying up several young plants, and didn't stop working when she approached. She asked him directly about his son's medicine. Tomas's hands went still. "The boy is fine," he said. "Mr. Rayner. He is. He just has a little trouble breathing at night." Winona waited. "The last box ran out 10 days ago," he said. "The fund used to cover 80%. Last month, I went to the pharmacy and they told me the card didn't work anymore. I thought it was a system error, so I paid cash. That box cost $310. He bent down and resumed tying the plant. "I haven't gone this month." Winona didn't ask another question. She returned to the records room and sat there for an hour and a half. She didn't go upstairs to Philip, didn't seek out Victor, and didn't mention anything to the 3 women sitting in the drawing room. She took out the emergency expenditure order forms, the kind the acting mistress of the estate was authorized to sign within the 72-hour period, and completed 3 of them. The first authorized $6,800 to replace the entire heat exchanger and 2 feeder valves in the staff quarters heating system, with the work to be completed overnight. The second authorized an immediate advance for medical expenses for 3 families living on the grounds who had relatives receiving long-term treatment, to be reimbursed after the fund was reviewed. The third ordered the accounting office to produce the original heating system maintenance contract signed on October 19th, together with the completion report and the name of the person who had signed to confirm receipt of the work. She signed all 3, recorded the time, and carried the third form downstairs, placing it in the document tray outside the accounting office because business hours had already ended. At 7 o'clock that evening, she called 3 repair companies. 2 refused because it was after hours. The third agreed on the condition that an additional emergency fee be paid, and that payment be made as soon as the work was completed. Winona agreed. Their truck entered the gates at 9:40. She remained in the mechanical room with the 2 technicians for nearly 4 hours, holding the light, reading the serial numbers from the old valves so they could verify them, and signing the completion report at 1:20 in the morning. Before they left, she asked them to photograph the parts they had removed and describe their condition clearly in the report. The older technician looked at the rusted block of metal in the bin, then looked at her. "Do you want me to write the truth? Or just write something down?" "Write the truth." He nodded and began to write. By the time Winona reached the corridor of the staff quarters, it was almost 2 o'clock in the morning, and warmth had begun to spread through the sleeping wing. No one came out of their room. No one knew. She walked the entire corridor once, placing her hand against the heating pipe at the beginning of the hall and again at the far end, then returned to her room, opened the small notebook, and added one more line to the first page beneath the figure of $4,200. Tomorrow, there would still be 2 days left. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Winona knocked on the door of Tomas Rayner's home in the western row and told him to put a warm coat on his son. Tomas stood in the doorway, still unable to understand what was happening. "Where are we going?" "The pharmacy opens at 7. If we leave now, we'll be back before your shift begins." He hesitated. "I don't have the money yet. The advance has already been authorized. You only need to bring your insurance card and the prescription." Leo wore a red coat, his eyes still heavy with sleep, and sat in the back seat without asking a single question. Winona drove the gardening department's old pickup truck through the gates at 6:20, and the three of them spoke hardly a word during the entire drive. At the pharmacy, the advance was confirmed after a 4-minute telephone call. Tomas received 2 boxes of medicine, read the instructions twice even though he already knew them by heart, then tucked them into the inside pocket of his coat. On the way back, after Leo had fallen asleep with his head resting against the window, Tomas finally turned toward her. "You only have 2 days left." "Yay." "Then why?" Winona kept her eyes on the road. "Because the boy has been without his medicine for 10 days. "No, I mean..." Tomas stopped, trying to find another way to say it. "The 3 women before you all had the same 3 days. None of them went down to the staff quarters. But you used your first day to repair the furnace and drive me to the pharmacy. You won't earn any points from this." "I know." "Then why?" She considered the question longer than he expected. "Because I sleep in that wing," she said. Room number 7. The truck reached the gates at 7:10. The night before, when everyone had gone to bed, the sleeping wing had still been cold, and by morning the heating pipes were warm. No announcement had been made. By breakfast, someone in the kitchen mentioned it. Then someone else said a repair truck had entered the gates at nearly 10 o'clock the previous night, and another person said they had seen Winona standing in the mechanical room, holding a light for the technicians, until almost 2 in the morning. No one added any comment. But by 9 o'clock, 3 people had gone to Helen. One was a laundry assistant, one was a kitchen helper, and the third was the storeroom attendant Vivienne had nearly dismissed. All 3 said the same thing, that they had heard Miss Vance was reviewing the records alone, and that they could stay through the afternoon shift to lighten some of her work. Helen asked whether they understood that there would be no overtime pay during these 3 days. All 3 said they did. She wrote their names in the ledger and said nothing more to anyone. The news reached the drawing room before noon, and there, it was repeated in a very different way. "She repaired the furnace," Vivienne said, setting down her coffee cup. "She has authority over an entire estate for 72 hours, and she spends the first day repairing the servant's furnace. And driving the gardener to the pharmacy," Margot added. "At 6 o'clock in the morning." Isabel laughed. "Perhaps she thinks this is a contest to see who can be the kindest." "No." Vivienne lifted her cup again. "She thinks this is still her old job." They put the keys in her hand, and she still believes she's working the night shift. All 3 women laughed, and within a minute the conversation had moved on to something else. That afternoon, Winona went down to the accounting office to ask about the 3rd order she had placed in the document tray the night before. The clerk on duty told her that Mr. Marchetti had taken it that morning and would respond when he had time. Winona thanked him and asked nothing further. She returned to the records room and took out the maintenance file for the 2nd time. By 9 o'clock that evening, she was alone in the room. She opened the file to page 14 and read the invoice for $4,200 again. But this time she didn't look at the amount. She looked at the top of the page. The contractor's name was printed in the upper left corner. Northline Facility Services. She sat motionless for a while. During her 2 years working at the estate, she had seen the names of electricians, plumbers, landscaping companies, window cleaning services, and at least 4 different repair contractors pass through the staff quarters. She had never heard this name before. She turned back through the preceding pages and searched for older maintenance invoices. Every one of them bore the name of another company that had worked with the estate for years. Northline had appeared for the first time in July of this year and continued operating through October. Winona copied the tax identification number printed at the bottom of the invoice into her small notebook, then opened the computer in the records room and accessed the New York Department of State business search page. She entered the number into the search field. The result appeared within seconds. Northline Facility Services, a limited liability company, registered on July 11th of that year. She studied the date, then scrolled down. There was no website, no business telephone number. The registered agent field listed only a third-party registration service. The personnel section was blank. She scrolled down one more line, reached the registered business address, and stopped. A street number on Roosevelt Avenue in Queens, followed by a string of unit characters. Winona opened another tab and searched the address. A street view image appeared. It showed a narrow storefront with lettering across the glass, wedged between a laundromat and a restaurant. It was a mailbox rental store. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd day, Winona was already seated in the records room with 18 files arranged in 2 stacks across the table. She didn't begin with Northline. She began with the first month of the 18-month period, and worked her way forward. By 7 o'clock, she had found the second one, a payment of $11,800 for replacing the drainage system on the eastern roof in March, carried out by a company whose name she had also never heard before. She kept turning pages and found the exact same quantity of materials, the same length of pipe, and the same number of connectors listed a second time in May, under a different invoice number and a different date. There was no completion report for either job. There was no name identifying who had signed to accept the work. By 9 o'clock, she had listed 4 companies. By noon, there were 6. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she stopped at 7 and couldn't find another one. 7 companies, all appearing for the first time within the past 18 months. None with contractor records stored in the system. All paid in full and on time. She added the figures 3 times with a handheld calculator, and all 3 calculations produced the same number, $2,300,000. She turned back to the estate's spending regulations, found the section governing approval thresholds, and read the line twice. Every expenditure of $25,000 or more required Philip Castellani's signature. She returned to her list and reviewed it from top to bottom. The largest payment made to any of those 7 companies was $23,900. Not one of them reached the threshold. Not a single payment had reached it during the entire 18 months. Winona put down her pen and sat motionless for a long time. She didn't enter anything into the records room computer. She hadn't opened it once that day, apart from the search she had performed the night before, and she had no intention of opening it again. Everything she recorded remained inside the small gray-covered notebook, written by hand, invoice numbers, dates, amounts, company names, and in the final column either a check mark or a question mark. That column contained 23 question marks. At 11 o'clock that night, she was still there. The records room door opened, and Helen entered carrying a cup of tea. She set it beside the stacks of files, looked across the table, then pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. "What time did you begin?" 5 o'clock. Helen looked at the open notebook, not attempting to read it, only taking in the number of pages already covered in writing. "Miss Vance, yes, I'm not asking what you're looking for. I only want to tell you something." She picked up the cup of tea, then set it down again without drinking. 4 years ago, a young man worked in accounting. His name was Bergen. He was young, meticulous, and had been here a little more than a year. One day, he went upstairs and asked Mr. Marchetti about several maintenance expenses. It wasn't anything serious. He only asked why some invoices had no reports attached to them. Winona didn't lift her eyes from the page, but her pen stopped moving. 3 days later, he submitted his resignation, Helen said. No one fired him. No one said anything to him. He simply handed in his notice and left. And the reason written on the form was that he was moving closer to home. His home was a 40-minute drive from here. She rose. "The tea is there. Drink it before it gets cold." She reached the door, then stopped. "You have a day and a half left. After that, you'll go back to scrubbing the second-floor corridor as you always have, and no one will remember these 3 days. That isn't a bad thing, Miss Vance." The door closed. Winona drank the entire cup of tea and continued working until well after midnight. At 1:15 in the morning, the door opened for the second time. There was no knock. Victor Marchetti stood in the doorway, still wearing his coat, as though he had just returned from outside, and he didn't step fully into the room. He looked at the 2 stacks of files on the table, then at the open notebook, and finally at her. "It's late, Miss Vance." "Yes, sir." "What are you looking for that's taking so long?" Winona put down her pen. She could have spoken the figure of $2,300,000 at that very moment. She could have opened the notebook wider and turned it around to face him. She thought of Helen, of the young man named Bergen, of the day and a half she had left, and of the fact that she didn't yet possess a single original document. "I'm reviewing the maintenance expenses," she said. "I signed an emergency expenditure order for the heating system the night before last. $6,800. Under the regulations, I have to account for that expense before my 72 hours end, so I'm looking for the maintenance limits from previous quarters to use as a comparison." It was the first lie she had ever told inside that house. Victor didn't answer immediately. He stepped inside, looked down at the stack of files on the left, and lifted the cover of the top file slightly with 2 fingers. 18 months. He let it fall shut. "You're being overly careful," he said. None of the 3 women before you accounted for anything. The 3 women before me weren't employees of this house, sir. Mr. Castellani told me personally that everything I signed would be reviewed. I know. I'm the one conducting the review. Victor fastened the button of his coat again. Your 3rd order, the one requesting the original maintenance contract from October. I received it. Yes, sir. I'll answer you at the end of the week. Winona looked at him. My 72 hours end tomorrow afternoon. That's unfortunate, Victor said, and he closed the door very softly behind him as he left. Winona waited 10 minutes after the sound of Victor's footsteps had faded completely at the end of the corridor, then switched on the lights above the innermost row of shelves. The past 18 months were only the active records. Behind them, against the wall, stood sealed archive boxes labeled by year and covered with a thin layer of dust. She pulled down the nearest box and read the label. She was no longer looking for maintenance invoices. She was looking for the same pattern in the past, working backward from the most recent year. There was nothing in the first 3 boxes. In the 4th, from 7 years earlier, she lifted the lid and discovered that it didn't contain the estate's operating records, but subcontracting records from the family's construction company. She was about to close it. Then she saw the name printed along the spine of the 2nd file from the left. Vance & Sons Contracting. Winona sat down on the floor with the file across her lap and didn't open it for nearly a minute. Then she did. The first page was a subcontract signed in April of that year, covering materials and labor for 3 projects in Brooklyn. Her father's signature appeared at the bottom of the page, the familiar slant in his handwriting, the long tail beneath the letter Y. She turned the pages. Beginning around page 20, the invoices grew thicker. Materials had been delivered to 3 addresses she had never heard her father mention. The quantities of steel and concrete far exceeded what the 3 projects listed in the contract could possibly have required. Every invoice carried Ray Vance's confirming signature in the lower right corner. She studied the first signature, then the 4th, then the 11th. The tail of the letter Y wasn't long. Not one of those signatures belonged to her father. In the second half of the file was an internal audit report prepared in September of that same year. The conclusion appeared on page 3. Every irregular flow of money had been traced through the subcontractor's account. The party responsible was named directly in a single line, without explanation. Vance & Sons Contracting. Clipped behind it was a copy of the notice sent to business partners, announcing the termination of all working relationships, along with a newspaper article cut out and pasted onto a sheet of letter-sized paper. Winona had read that article 7 years earlier, at the age of 20, in the kitchen of their apartment in Queens, while her mother called from the hospital. She read it again now at 27, sitting on the floor of the records room inside the very house that had issued it. She turned through the final pages. There was no completion report, no name identifying who had accepted the deliveries. Not one delivery address matched the original contract. It was the same pattern, only 7 years earlier and on a larger scale, with one additional name chosen to take the fall. Ray Vance lost his contractor's license in November. He sold the house the following February, to finish paying the suppliers who still believed him. He suffered a stroke in August, 11 months after the audit report was signed, while sitting at a table filling out a job application for a plumbing company in Flushing. Winona didn't cry. She sat on the floor with her back against the shelving and the file open across her lap, and she remained that way for a very long time. Beyond the small window high on the wall, the sky was still black. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the morning before she finally stood. She carried the file back to the table, placed it beside the small notebook, then opened her wallet. In the innermost compartment was a photograph with worn corners, taken outside the company office in Queens. Her father stood in the middle with one hand resting on her shoulder, and behind them hung a wooden sign bearing the words Vance & Sons. She placed the photograph on the table, propping it against the stack of files. In 2 years, she had scrubbed the second-floor staircase of this house 400 times. She had replaced the towels in Mr. Marchetti's room, carried coffee into the accounting office, and passed the records room door every Tuesday morning when she came to collect clean linens. She thought about that exactly once, then stopped. She could close the notebook, put it in her bag, and walk through the gates before dawn. No one would stop her. Her 72 hours would end that afternoon, whether she was present or not, and nothing written in that notebook could return her father's license, his house, or the final 11 months of his life. She could take it to a newspaper. She could carry it to the federal prosecutor's office in Brooklyn. She could sit perfectly still and do nothing, and not one person in this world would have the right to blame her. Then she thought about the furnace that had remained broken for 3 weeks in November. She thought about the $310 box of medicine Tomas had paid for in cash, and the new supply he hadn't dared to purchase that month. She thought about Helen, 61 years old, sleeping in the last room at the end of the corridor, about the 3 people who had volunteered for an unpaid extra shift the day before, and about the 32 people sleeping roughly 130 feet from where she sat, none of them aware that their medical fund had been canceled in September, all of them destined to remain unaware if she walked out through the gates at 4 o'clock in the morning. The same pattern, the same man signing. And this time, it was still happening. Winona pulled the chair closer to the table. She took down the photograph, brushed the dust from its edge, and laid it face up beside the notebook. Then she opened the file to the next page and picked up her pen. At 9 o'clock that morning, Winona knocked on the accounting office door with a completed request form already bearing her signature. Victor Marchetti was standing beside the printer. He read the paper twice, then placed it on the desk. 7 contracts. The originals, sir, along with the completion reports and the name of the person who signed for each delivery. Do you understand what you're asking for? I do. Those are estate operating expenses from the past 18 months, which fall within the authority assigned to me during these 72 hours. No. Victor picked up the paper and returned it to her, not harshly, almost politely. Those are the family's financial records. Your 3-day authority covers the active operating budget. It doesn't include contracts that have already been closed. It doesn't include contractor files, and it certainly doesn't include reopening 18 months of finalized accounts. Then who is allowed to see them? Mr. Castellani. And me. Winona didn't take the paper back. She left it lying on the desk between them. You said you would answer my 3rd request at the end of the week, she said. My 72 hours end at 7 o'clock tonight. I don't believe those 2 things are a coincidence. Victor looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice remained as even as before. Miss Vance, I've kept the books for this family for 24 years. I was sitting at this desk before Mr. Castellani's father died. You've been holding a mop for 2 years. Then, during those 24 years, where did $2,300,000 go? He didn't become angry. That was what sent a chill along her spine. He merely straightened, fastened one button of his suit jacket, and smiled, a small smile that was almost pleased. You should discuss that with Mr. Castellani, he said. I suggest you do it soon. Winona went to the ground floor study at 10 o'clock. Philip was standing beside the desk with 2 files already open, and he looked up when she entered. She placed the small notebook on the desk, opened it, and turned it toward him. She spoke for 4 minutes, adding nothing beyond what was written on the pages. 7 companies, 18 months, 23 question marks, duplicate invoices listing the same quantities of materials on different dates, no completion reports, no names identifying who had accepted the work, not one payment reaching the $25,000 approval threshold, a total of $2,300,000. Philip read every line. He turned 3 pages, returned to the first, and read it again. Where are the originals? I don't have them. The completion reports? They don't exist. That's the problem. Who confirmed for you that they don't exist? Winona was silent for half a second. No one. I requested the original documents this morning. Mr. Marchetti refused. Philip set the notebook down. You're telling me that the man who has kept my family's books for 24 years removed $2,300,000 from this estate, and your evidence is a notebook written in ballpoint pen. My evidence is 18 files sitting in the records room, sir. The notebook is only where I recorded what I found. You can go down there now and compare everything yourself. It will take about 2 hours. Or, I can call Victor up here and ask him. Yes, you can. The door opened. Sabrina Ferraro entered carrying a file, stopped when she saw Winona, then looked down at the small notebook lying open on the desk. I'm sorry. I brought the 3rd quarter reconciliation you asked for yesterday. She placed it down, and she didn't leave. What's happening? Philip didn't answer. Neither did Winona. Sabrina looked at the notebook once more, and she understood very quickly. Miss Vance is accusing Victor? I'm presenting a discrepancy in the estate's operating expenses, Winona said. To whom? To Mr. Castellani. Only to Mr. Castellani? Sabrina asked. and there was no sharpness in her voice. She spoke next with the genuine concern of someone who believed every word she was saying. "Philip, I'm not defending Victor. If that figure is correct, then it has to be investigated fully, and it has to be done now. But please listen to me for 1 minute." She turned toward Winona, then back to him. "Over the past 3 months, this family has lost 2 shipments and 1 warehouse. You told me that information existed only inside this house. Then, you handed the keys to 5 women. And among those 5, there was exactly 1 who had lived on these grounds, eaten, and slept here for 2 years, knew every passageway, and knew who worked every shift." Winona didn't take her eyes off her. "That person was given authority on Monday morning," Sabrina continued. "By Tuesday night, she was in the records room at 1 o'clock in the morning. By Wednesday morning, she was standing here, accusing by name the one person in this house capable of discovering money flowing outward. You're the one who taught me that when there's an insider, the first thing they do is point at someone else. You're saying she fabricated this. I'm saying I don't know. That's what makes it frightening." Sabrina placed one hand on the edge of the desk. "If she's right, you lose, Victor. If she's wrong, then you've just stood by while a stranger opened the family's entire financial archive and copied it by hand. Do you have a copy of that notebook, Philip? Do you know where it has been during the past 2 nights?" Philip looked at the small notebook on the desk. He thought about the harbor police arriving 40 minutes before the unloading at dock number 4. He thought about what Nico had said in this very room 3 weeks earlier, that if the insider was a member of the staff, then Philip had just handed the keys to the house to 5 strangers. Then he looked at Winona, who remained motionless, neither arguing nor offering any further explanation, her hands resting at her sides, and for the first time since she had entered the room, he didn't know who he was looking at. Philip told her to leave the notebook on the desk and step outside. Winona set it down without arguing and left the room. She had 9 hours remaining. She didn't return to the records room. She went down to the security station in the basement and requested a printed copy of the duty schedule for the most recent 30 days, something that clearly fell within the scope of her 72-hour authority. The officer on duty looked at her for a moment, then printed 4 pages. Winona sat at the desk outside and began reading from the last page backward. The column on the right contained the system event log. Most of the entries were the same: shift changes, gate inspections, warehouse doors secured. On the second page, she stopped. November 11th, 2:20 in the morning. The East Corridor camera cluster switched to offline mode. 3 o'clock. Restored. The reason entered in the remarks field was system maintenance. She moved to the line beneath it. November 12th, 2:20. 3 o'clock. System maintenance. She continued reading and found the same entry 6 consecutive times, on each of the past 6 nights. The same camera cluster, the same time, the same 40-minute interval, the same stated reason. There was no technician's name in the responsible party column. She asked the officer on duty who scheduled the maintenance. He said camera system maintenance was approved and contracted through the accounting office, and the security station only received notification. Winona asked one more question: whether anyone had passed through the East Corridor during those 6 nights. The officer said the East Corridor led to 3 places: the supply warehouse, the North Gate, and the entrance to the records room. She wrote all 3 down in a fresh notebook she took from the desk drawer. She turned to the final page, the duty schedule for the following week, and it took her about a minute to understand what she was seeing. 4 overnight shifts assigned to the regular security team had been crossed out. In their place was the name of a private security company, followed by 4 names she had never seen on the payroll. In the lower corner of the page was a note referring to a temporary security staffing contract, the contract number, the date signed 9 days earlier, and the name of the person who had signed it, Victor Marchetti. It was scheduled to take effect at 11 o'clock the following night. Winona asked one final question: whether the 4 new men had come to receive a handover. The officer said they had not. They were expected to arrive directly the following evening. She thanked him, took the 4 pages, and went to find Nico Barone. He was in the rear courtyard inspecting 2 vehicles that had just returned. She handed him the 4 pages and pointed to the event log. 6 consecutive nights, the same time, the same camera cluster. Nico read it without revealing anything on his face. What's unusual about system maintenance? Maintenance is usually scheduled during the day, and maintenance records include the technician's name. These 6 entries have no name. What do you know about camera maintenance? Nothing, Winona said. but I know how to read an empty column. Nico turned to the final page and paused longer over the duty schedule. I didn't approve this. I know. Mr. Marchetti signed it. He has the authority to sign temporary staffing contracts. Yes, but these are 4 overnight shifts covering the secondary gate and the east corridor. And those 4 men will arrive tomorrow night without any handover. Nico folded the 4 pages. Miss Vance. Yes. This morning you went to Mr. Castellani's study and accused Mr. Marchetti. Now it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you've come to me with a duty schedule bearing his name. He looked at her. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying it's a great deal for one day. I have 9 hours. That's exactly what troubles me. Winona didn't answer that. You don't have to believe me, she said. You only have to call that security company and ask whom they assigned. And if you're free tonight, stand in the east corridor at 2:20. Nico slipped the 4 pages into the inside pocket of his coat. I'll call. I'm not promising anything else. He called at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The security company's switchboard confirmed that there was a contract, confirmed that 4 personnel had been assigned, and when Nico asked for their names, the person on the other end said the list had been specified directly by the client and had not been selected by the company. Nico asked the question a second time, received the same answer, then thanked them and ended the call. He remained seated in the vehicle for quite a while before reaching into his coat, taking out the 4 pages, and reading them again from the beginning. Upstairs, in the accounting office, Victor Marchetti locked the door from the inside at 4:20. He didn't sit down. He stood beside the window and looked down into the rear courtyard, where Nico Barone was still sitting inside the vehicle, and he remained there for nearly 2 minutes. Then he took a small black telephone from the deepest drawer of the filing cabinet, the kind of telephone he had never used inside that house, and dialed a number he had not saved. It rang twice. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't give his name. He didn't address the person who answered by name. Move it to tonight. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, Victor Marchetti asked to see Philip and brought with him a thin file. For the first 30 seconds, he said nothing. He simply placed 3 items on the desk, one by one, leaving several seconds between them like a man dealing cards. The first was a set of 4 images taken from the camera in the records room corridor. Winona Vance entered at 1:12 in the morning and left at 4:50. The second was a pair of close photographs, showing the small gray-covered notebook lying open, taken from above and clear enough for the invoice numbers and company names to be read. What time were these taken? Philip asked. 3 o'clock on Wednesday morning. The camera inside the records room. She doesn't know it's there. The third item was a bank statement. Philip looked down. An account in the name of Winona Vance, opened at a branch in Queens, had received $15,000 on October 19th. The transfer came from an intermediary account overseas, with no beneficiary name, only a string of codes. October 19th, Victor said. The exact date shown on that fraudulent heating system repair invoice, making it look like she took a kickoff to stay silent. Philip said nothing. I don't like this any more than you do, Victor said. But you asked me who has been selling information outside for the past 3 months. That person would have to live on the grounds, know the duty schedules, and have a reason to point elsewhere once pressure began closing in. At 6:15 that evening, Philip summoned everyone to the grand drawing room. All 32 employees stood along the walls on either side. Vivienne, Isabel, Margot, and Sabrina sat in the row of chairs near the fireplace. Rosario was wheeled in last. Winona stood in the center of the room. Philip placed the 3 items on the table and spoke in an even voice, not loudly. He read the time she had entered and the time she had left. He displayed the 2 photographs of the notebook. He read aloud the figure of $15,000 and the date, October 19th. No one in the room moved. Do you have an account at a branch in Queens? He asked. Yes. Did you receive $15,000 on October 19th? No. Can you explain it? No. I hadn't seen that paper until 30 seconds ago. Philip picked up the 3 photographs, then set them down again. Your authority ends at this moment, he said. You will leave the estate before nightfall. Someone at the far end of the room drew in a sharp breath. Rosaria placed one hand on the arm of her wheelchair and began to speak. Philip, listen to me. Winona turned around. She took 2 steps toward the old woman, rested her hand over Rosaria's, and shook her head once. Please don't, ma'am. You don't understand what's happening. I do. She held Rosaria's hand for one more second, then released it. She returned to the center of the room, removed the ring of brass keys from her belt, and placed it in Philip's palm. He had to close his fingers around it because she didn't set it on the table. She didn't cry. She didn't say she was innocent again. She didn't mention her father, didn't mention the photograph in her wallet, and didn't mention the name she had found in the 4th archive box. "I may be wrong about many things, sir," she said. "I may be wrong about those 7 companies. I may be wrong about Mr. Marchetti. Perhaps I misread all 18 files." Philip remained still. "But the cameras in the East Corridor will still go dark at 2:20 this morning," she said, "just as they did on the previous 6 nights. And the 4 men assigned to tomorrow night's shift will arrive directly at the secondary gate without receiving a handover from anyone. You can dismiss me." "You can't dismiss that hour." She looked around the room once without allowing her gaze to rest on anyone. "The 4 pages of duty schedules are in Mr. Barone's inside pocket. I didn't print them. The security station did. Anyone can examine them." Then she fell silent, and she didn't say another word. Vivienne leaned slightly toward Margot and whispered something so quietly that only the first row could hear. That she had said from the beginning that no one employed by the house should have been allowed to participate. Sabrina said nothing. She looked down at her hands. Nico Barone stood in the doorway with one hand still inside his coat, and he didn't take out the 4 pages. Philip opened his palm and looked at the ring of keys, then closed his fingers around it again. "You have half an hour to collect your belongings." Winona nodded once. "Yes, sir." She walked toward the door. All 32 people moved aside to clear a path for her, and not one of them said a word. That was what Helen Marsh would remember most clearly about that evening. Winona returned to room number 7 and packed her belongings into one cloth bag and a cardboard box. She didn't own much. She removed the photograph taken outside the office in Queens from the file where she had tucked it the previous night and placed it back inside her wallet. At 6:50, she walked out through the rear door. Helen was waiting at the beginning of the path with her coat draped over one arm. The 2 women walked more than 650 feet to the main gate without speaking once. At the gate, Helen opened her bag and took out a small envelope. 3 days' wages. "I'm giving it to you myself. It didn't go through accounting." Winona accepted it. "Thank you. Miss Vance?" Helen stopped. "Where will you sleep tonight?" "I'll find somewhere." "Do you have money?" "Yes, ma'am." Helen looked at her, and she was the only person in that house who had looked Winona directly in the eyes throughout the entire evening. "I believe you," she said. Winona didn't answer that. She only thanked her once more, then stepped through the gates and turned left onto the perimeter road, while Helen remained there watching until she could no longer see her. The diner stood a little over half a mile from the estate gates, beside the curve in the perimeter road, and stayed open all night for truck drivers. Winona placed her cloth bag on the seat beside her and ordered a cup of coffee. She intended to remain there until the earliest bus, at 5:15, took her back to Queens. She sat beside the window, and from there, looking slightly uphill, she could see the eastern section of the estate wall and the turn leading to the secondary gate. She had no intention of looking in that direction, but at 11:40, a car stopped beside the turn, and 4 men got out. Winona set down her coffee cup. The estate's overnight security team changed shifts at 11 o'clock, and the handover took place inside the guardhouse on the grounds, not out on the road. The 4 men stood at the roadside for 3 minutes. None of them went inside, and they passed through the secondary gate only when the 2 previous guards came out. There was no handover. No logbook was signed. At 11:52, 2 small trucks approached from the opposite direction and parked about 230 feet from the secondary gate, close against the line of trees. The name of a landscaping company was printed along their sides. Both carried temporary plates issued to newly registered vehicles. Their lights went out. No one emerged. Winona stared at the 2 trucks for 3 seconds. Then she stood, left money on the table, and picked up her bag. She didn't walk toward the main gates. She circled north along the dirt road bordering the nursery grounds until she reached the service gate, used by vegetable deliveries and laundry trucks in the morning. She opened it with the key to the staff quarters, the only key she still possessed, because the brass ring had been in Philip's hand for 7 hours. There was no fencing, no camera, and no light along that section. She reached the rear courtyard at 12:40. The second-floor lights were still burning in the main house. No one knew she had returned. She knocked 3 times on Helen's door. Helen opened it within seconds, still fully dressed. "Miss Vance." The 4 new guards entered at 11:40. There was no handover. 2 trucks are parked outside on the road with their lights off, and no one has gotten out. Helen looked at her for a moment, then opened the door wider. "What do you want me to do?" "Get everyone out of these quarters." "Where will they go?" "St. Brigid Church, 2 miles away. It takes 40 minutes on foot, and the gardening truck can carry 1 load. You have no authority anymore." "I know. I'm not asking for authority. I'm asking you." Helen reached for her coat. "If you're wrong, I'll lose my job in the morning." "Yes. And if you're right?" Winona didn't answer. Helen buttoned her coat and stepped into the corridor. She knocked on the first door. "Wake up. Put on something warm. Don't turn on the light." The person inside asked what was happening. Helen didn't explain. She said only one sentence, and repeated that exact sentence at every remaining door. "I've served this house for 30 years. Miss Vance is right." The first door opened, then the third, then the entire corridor. No one asked what authority Miss Vance had. No one mentioned what had happened that afternoon. The laundry assistant, who had volunteered for an unpaid extra shift the day before, was the first person to enter the hallway with a coat in hand. The storeroom attendant went to knock on the remaining doors in the western row. During the 40-minute intervals of the previous 3 nights, Winona had been the only person who came down to the staff quarters, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, that was all the reason 32 people needed. At 1 o'clock, the first person left through the rear door. Winona stood at the beginning of the path with a sheet of paper and a pen, reading names from the duty roster and marking off each person as they passed. She didn't allow anyone to go back for belongings. Each person was permitted to carry 1 bag. Tomas Rayner carried Leo, still asleep and wrapped in a blanket, and stopped in front of her for half a second. "You already left. Go ahead. Remember the medicine." He nodded and continued. The gardening truck departed at 1:15, carrying 11 older adults and 3 children, leaving through the service gate with its headlights off until it reached the dirt road. The second group walked single file along the road beside the nursery, and no one spoke. Winona walked last. They reached St. Brigid Church at 1:45, and the priest opened the side door without asking many questions after seeing the crowd gathered in the churchyard. Winona counted everyone a second time against the list. 32. Everyone was there. She handed the paper to Helen. "Keep this. If anyone asks, tell them it was your decision, not mine." "Where are you going?" Winona had already turned away. Mr. Castellani, his grandmother, the other 4 women, Mr. Marchetti, and the security team are still inside the main house. None of them knows what's happening beyond the secondary gate. Helen took 1 step after her. "Miss Vance, please close the door, ma'am." She walked back alone along the road beside the nursery and reached the service gate at 2:12. In the rear staff quarters, all 32 doors stood open. Every room was empty, and the heating pipes were still warm. In the main house, the second-floor lights had gone dark long ago. The clock in the rear hall showed 2:18. At 2:20, the entire estate went dark. There was no explosion, no sound of an electrical short, only everything shutting off at once as the faint hum of the ventilation system vanished, leaving behind a silence so dense that Winona could hear the wind slipping through the narrow gaps around the rear hall door. The emergency lights didn't come on. 4 seconds later, in the basement security station, the East Corridor camera cluster went offline, and this time, nothing was entered into the log because no one was sitting there anymore. The secondary gate opened from the inside. Winona heard the hinges before she heard the footsteps. She was standing in the rear hall, and she did 3 things in about 10 seconds. She pulled shut the steel door separating the rear hall from the kitchen corridor, slid the horizontal bolt into place, and backed into the kitchen instead of running toward the main house. Outside, the footsteps passed quickly, never stopping at the steel door, then scattered toward the main staircase. From the east came another sound entirely, low and heavy, the sound of a thick wooden door being forced open. 3 seconds later came the smell of smoke. The records room stood at the end of the east corridor. The fire caught quickly and evenly, nothing like an electrical fire, and in less than a minute it had reached the doorframe. 18 active operating files, archive boxes labeled by year, and stacked against the innermost wall. 24 years of records. At the north gate, a vehicle engine started. Victor Marchetti didn't run. He walked at an ordinary pace, carrying a small safe in his left hand and an external hard drive in his right, and he reached the vehicle before the flames grew bright enough for anyone on the second floor to see them through a window. Inside the main house, Vivian Calloway locked her bedroom door and pushed a chair against it. Margot Whitfield hid inside the dressing room and turned off her telephone. Isabel Renaud called the emergency number 3 times, and all 3 calls dropped. Sabrina Ferraro wasn't in her room. No one saw her leave, and no one saw her anywhere during the next 20 minutes. Philip came down to the first floor by the servants' staircase instead of using the main stairs. He went first to his grandmother's room, opened the door, and found Rosaria sitting upright in bed in the darkness, fully awake. She told him she was fine, and ordered him to go. He locked her door from the outside and continued. He reached the kitchen corridor at 2:27, and stopped when the beam of a flashlight swept across the narrow gap beneath the steel door. He opened it. Winona was standing beside the wine cellar entrance, holding the heavy steel door with one hand, while gripping a flashlight backward in the crook of her other arm, and she was sliding the upper bolt into place. A sheet of paper lay on the kitchen table. "You already left." She didn't turn around immediately. She secured the lower bolt, tested the door by pulling on it twice, and only then looked up. "All 32 people are at St. Brigid Church. Everyone is accounted for. Mrs. Marsh has the list." Philip looked at the paper on the kitchen table, then at her. Footsteps sounded overhead, more than one person. The firelight from the east had begun to spread across the corridor ceiling. "What do you need?" he asked. Winona didn't ask him to repeat the question. She didn't say a single word about what had happened that afternoon. 2 people stationed at this cellar door. "And they don't leave," she said. "Flashlights, as many as possible, from the cabinet in the west corridor. Your men need to be told that the secondary gate was opened, not forced, and I need someone with enough authority that they'll obey me immediately, without asking questions." Philip reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out the ring of brass keys and placed it in her palm. She closed her hand around it. Nico Barone appeared at the far end of the corridor with 2 other men, their flashlight beams sweeping across the floor. Philip turned toward them and spoke loudly enough for the entire corridor to hear. "Miss Vance speaks for me. Anyone who doesn't obey her answers to me." Nico stopped for half a second, looked at Winona, then nodded once. "Tell us what to do." Winona began speaking and didn't stop for 4 minutes. The wine cellar was the only place in the house with 2 layers of steel doors. Rosaria had to be taken down there, with 2 people remaining outside, and they were not to open the door for anyone who couldn't call them by their correct names. The 4 new night guards weren't security employees. They had entered through the secondary gate and opened it from the inside at 2:20. The 3 remaining women were on the second floor, in rooms 3, 5, and 8. Anyone bringing them downstairs had to use the servants' staircase, not the main staircase, because the main stairs emptied directly into the grand hall, and the grand hall was already lit by the fire. The east corridor was burning, and no one was to enter it to save anything. Someone had to reach the north gate immediately, because it was the only entrance without cameras, and no one was guarding it. "How long has the north gate been empty?" Nico asked. "Since 11 o'clock. The 4 new men never took over that post." Nico handed his flashlight to the man beside him and began to run. Philip watched him go, then turned back. The flames were bright enough now for him to see Winona's face clearly, and she was reading the list on the kitchen table again, marking it with a pencil and counting the people who still remained inside the main house. At 2:41, the 3 women had been brought downstairs by the servants' staircase, and Rosaria was inside the wine cellar behind its 2 layers of steel doors. Winona marked off the final 4 names on the sheet and went into the first floor corridor to count the remaining security men again. Philip went with her. The corridor ran along the eastern side of the house, and the entire row of windows on the left had become a shifting band of light as the fire in the records room licked its way up the outside wall. Philip stopped in the middle of the corridor to listen to the footsteps overhead. He stood directly inside that field of light with his back to the windows, and for those 3 seconds, he was the only thing in the hallway that could be seen clearly. Winona was looking down at the list. She raised her head for a reason she could never explain afterward, and she saw movement in the doorway at the far end of the corridor before anyone else did. There was no time to call his name. She threw herself forward and drove her entire body into his shoulder. The gunshot was very short and dry, and sounded far quieter than people imagined such a sound would be. Philip fell to the left and struck his shoulder against the wall. By the time he turned around, Winona had collapsed onto the floor, with her back against the stone baseboard, her right hand gripping its edge. Footsteps ran from the far end of the corridor, and 2 of Nico's men gave chase. Philip crawled to her. He removed his coat, folded it into quarters, and pressed it against her left shoulder with both hands. "Look at me." She was still conscious. Her eyes were open, and she was trying to sit upright. "Don't sit up. The north gate. Be quiet. The north gate," she said again. Her voice was faint but clear. "Victor. The hard drive." Philip raised his head and shouted. Two men came running. He kept both hands pressed against her shoulder and told the first man to call for an ambulance over the radio, not by telephone, and told the second to run to the north gate and tell Barone that there was a safe and a hard drive. Winona was still looking at him. "Don't let it reach the main road." Then she closed her eyes, and Philip called her name, and she opened them again. At the north gate, Nico Barone had stopped the vehicle 10 minutes earlier by driving his own car across the exit and removing the key. Victor Marchetti didn't resist. He remained inside the vehicle with both hands resting on the steering wheel until Nico's men opened the door, then stepped out like a man returning home late from work. He spoke only one sentence throughout the entire process, that he wanted to call his lawyer. At 3:15, the first ambulance entered through the main gates. At 4 o'clock, the fire in the eastern corridor was brought under control. At 6:40, as daylight began to spread across the sky, the safe and the hard drive were opened in the grand dining room in front of Philip, Nico, 2 men from the family, and the 32 employees who had just been brought back from St. Brigid Church. Helen Marsh stood at the far end of the table. The hard drive was opened first. It contained 4 folders. The first held records for 19 non-existent contracting companies, spanning 12 years. The 7 names Winona had listed were only the most recent. The total amount of money that had passed through them, according to a spreadsheet Victor himself had maintained for his own records, was $41,300,000. The second folder contained the overseas intermediary accounts, including the account that had transferred $15,000 into Winona Vance's name on October 19th. The third folder contained only one file. It was an agreement granting long-term operating rights over the family's entire Red Hook waterfront property to an entity registered in Delaware, represented by Anton Novak. The price stated in the agreement was approximately 1/4 of the property's market value. At the end of the document was Victor Marchetti's signature in his capacity as asset manager, along with an effective date clause, stating that the agreement would become enforceable from the moment Philip Castellani no longer held executive authority. No one in the room spoke for nearly a minute. Nico was the one who read the clause aloud a second time. The safe was opened last. There was no money inside. There were only papers, arranged in 3 bundles and tied with string. The first bundle contained the original contracts for the 7 companies from the most recent 18 months. The second contained the completion reports that had never been placed in the records archive. The third was thinner than the other 2, and a year had been written by hand across its cover. 7 years earlier. Philip opened it. It was the original, unaltered version of the subcontractor file, whose modified copy had been stored in the 4th archive box in the records room, the file that had burned to ashes during the night. Here, on every materials invoice, in the lower right corner, there was no signature belonging to Ray Vance. There was Victor Marchetti's signature. Philip continued turning the pages. The internal accounting sheet on the final page clearly stated that the money had been routed through the subcontractor's account, and beside each amount was a note written in pencil, the private reminder of a man writing only for himself. Beside the final amount, the words read, "If audited, shifted onto Vance." Philip read the sentence. Then he looked at the name printed across the file cover, Vance & Sons Contracting, and he thought about the hand he had kept pressed against her left shoulder for 20 minutes, and about the photograph with worn corners that the paramedics had taken from her wallet while searching for identification. He placed the paper on the table and said nothing. The hospital in Mineola reported the gunshot injury within 1 hour, as required by New York state law, and by 9 o'clock that morning, Special Agent Claire Dunn of the Organized Crime Task Force was standing in the 3rd-floor corridor. She didn't enter the room immediately. She remained outside and read Nico Barone's entire statement first, then knocked on the door. Winona regained consciousness that afternoon. The surgery had removed the bullet, and her collarbone wasn't broken. But the doctor told her the bullet had passed close to the brachial plexus, and that particular damage couldn't be corrected with another operation. He said she might regain some of her grip strength within 6 months to a year. He promised nothing more. Winona lay still for a while, then asked him only one question, whether she would still be able to write with her left hand. He said it was highly unlikely. She thanked him. After he left, She raised her left hand from the blanket and studied it for a long time, turning her wrist and trying to close her fingers. Helen sat in the chair beside her and said nothing. "I'm left-handed," Winona said. "I know." She lowered her hand. "I still have the other one." 3 days later, Claire Dunn completed the trail of the $15,000 transfer. It had left an intermediary account in the Cayman Islands on October 19th, but that account had only been the second stage. The first transfer originated from a trust account in Connecticut, and the person with complete authority over that account was Sabrina Ferraro. That same day, 4 calls had been made from her telephone to a number identified as belonging to an intermediary working for Anton Novak. What she had sold wasn't financial information. She had sold the internal security schedule, the layout of the secondary gates, and the shift change times. In return, she had coordinated with Victor to frame Winona, routing the bribe into Winona's account back on October 19th to ensure she would be the perfect scapegoat if anyone ever investigated the accounting records. Dunn questioned her in the small sitting room, with Philip standing beside the door. "You knew what they intended to do that night, didn't you?" "They said they were only going to frighten him. That was all. Cut the power, enter the house, make him understand that he couldn't stand alone anymore." Sabrina was speaking faster than usual. "I didn't know they would shoot anyone. I swear I didn't know they would shoot." Winona was seated across the room with her left arm secured in a sling. "You didn't ask," she said, "because the answer might have kept you from winning." Sabrina turned to look at her and couldn't answer. A bureau vehicle stopped in the front courtyard at 11 o'clock. She was led away along the same path she had walked when she arrived 3 weeks earlier, while Vivienne, Isabel, and Margot stood on the steps and watched. The following morning, Philip summoned everyone to the grand drawing room for the second time. All 32 employees stood along the walls as they had before. The 3 remaining women formed a short line to the left of the fireplace. Rosaria was wheeled in and stopped beside the hearth, both hands resting in her lap. Winona had been discharged from the hospital the previous afternoon. She had no other clothes at the estate, so she wore her uniform again, with her left arm still in the sling. Helen Marsh stepped into the center of the room carrying the wooden box and placed it on the table before Philip. "What is this?" he asked. "The 5th turn, sir." Helen stood straight. Miss Vance's 72 hours ended at 7 o'clock on Wednesday evening. Under the rules you established, the vote was supposed to take place on Thursday morning, so I held it. Nico cut the seal. All 32 ballots were read aloud, one by one, and by the 10th ballot, no one in the room was moving anymore. 32 ballots. Not one left blank, not one vote against her. A perfect score, the only one across all 5 turns. Helen placed the final ballot on the table. She was dismissed, and she still received all 32 votes, she said. "I thought you should know that." Philip looked at the stack of ballots for a long time. Then he walked around the table, crossed to the center of the room, stopped before Winona, and lowered himself onto one knee. Vivienne drew in a breath loud enough to be heard. Margot turned her face away. Isabel remained still, both hands clasped tightly together. Rosaria raised one hand to her mouth, and she smiled. "Winona Vance," Philip said, "I'm not inviting you to become mistress of this estate. I'm asking you to become my wife." The entire room fell silent. Winona looked at him, and she allowed that silence to last far longer than anyone expected. "No," she said. Someone at the far end of the room made a small sound, then immediately fell quiet. "You're kneeling here because I took a bullet for you," Winona said. "If no shot had been fired that night, Mr. Marchetti would still be sitting in the accounting office this morning, and I would still be scrubbing the second-floor corridor. Nothing would have changed except that I was shot." Philip didn't rise. "I told you everything at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning," she continued. "I had the numbers. I didn't have the originals. You chose to believe the man who held the official seal. I understand why you made that choice, but I don't need you to believe me after blood has already been spilled." She looked around the room once, then returned her gaze to him. "You don't need another loyal person, sir. You need to become the kind of man who recognizes loyalty before it has to bleed for you." She slipped her right hand into the pocket of her uniform, took out the ring of brass keys, and placed it on the table beside the stack of ballots. Then she walked toward the door. All 32 people moved aside to make way for her a second time. Philip remained kneeling in the center of the room, and he didn't stand, and no one tried to stop her. Winona had not yet reached the main door when she heard the wheels of Rosaria's chair moving across the wooden floor behind her. The old woman had pushed herself into the middle of the hallway, one hand holding an envelope yellowed around the edges. "Take this with you." Winona turned back. Rosaria offered the envelope with both hands, and Winona had to accept it with her right. Inside were two things. The first was a newspaper clipping from the business section, dated 7 years earlier, with a bold headline about a contractor in Queens, accused of invoice fraud. She had already read that article. The second was a check dated 6.5 years earlier, made out to Ray Vance, and never deposited. "You knew," Winona said. "It wasn't a question. I knew from the moment I read that article," Rosaria said. "I didn't know who had done it. I only knew something like that couldn't have happened inside my family's company, without someone in this house being involved." I asked Victor. He gave me a thick file and told me everything had been fully audited. She looked down at the check in Winona's hand. "I wrote that 3 weeks after your father's funeral. I never sent it. I thought sending money to a family that had just lost everything would only be a way of buying peace for myself." Winona stood motionless. 2 years ago I found you," Rosaria said. "You were working 3 shifts a day in Queens, a morning shift in an office building, an afternoon shift at a clinic, and a night shift at a restaurant. I reviewed your application and told Mrs. Marsh to hire you." She paused. "I brought you into this house because I wanted to make amends. I never imagined you would be the one to save it." Winona folded the newspaper clipping and slipped it into her uniform pocket. Then she placed the check back inside the envelope and returned it to Rosaria. "I'll only keep the article, ma'am." Rosaria accepted the envelope and didn't insist. Winona bent down and kissed her forehead once, then walked out the door. 3 weeks later, Philip gathered the entire staff in the grand dining room and brought down 19 files, placing them on the table. He told them that the supplemental medical fund had been canceled in September without anyone in that room being informed, that it would be restored beginning the following day, and that every medical expense they had paid themselves during the previous 4 months would be reimbursed if they still had receipts, and if they didn't, they should submit a statement anyway. He went on to say that beginning the next quarter, there would be a 5-member employee council elected by the staff themselves, with the right to review quarterly operating expenses and the right to object. Then he asked whether anyone had anything to say. No one spoke. He waited. 1 minute passed, then 2, and he remained standing there. Finally, the laundry assistant raised his hand and asked who would make the final decision if the council objected. "I will," Philip said. "Then what is the point of objecting, sir?" "So that I have to explain myself," Philip said. "Before now, I've never had to explain myself to anyone in this room." That same month, he turned over the entire hard drive, the safe, and all 19 files to Special Agent Claire Dunn, along with an inventory he had prepared himself. Dunn asked whether he had an attorney. He said he did. She asked whether he understood that what he was surrendering could be used against him. He said that 3 divisions of the family business were being converted into legitimate operations, that the process would take several years and cost a great deal of money, and that he was beginning that day. Rosaria died in her sleep on an April morning, 3 days after the trees in the garden had begun to grow leaves. On the table beside her bed lay her old wedding ring and a folded piece of paper, written in a trembling hand but still legible. "Don't give it to anyone simply because you're afraid of losing them." In July, Philip found Winona at a community center on Northern Boulevard in Queens. It was an evening class with 14 students, most of them women. She was writing on the board with her right hand, the letters slow and awkward and leaning toward the left, and she finished the entire line before turning back to continue teaching. He stood at the rear of the room until the class ended. "You didn't come to ask me to return," she said. "No." He handed her a file. Inside were the founding documents for a fund bearing the Vance name, providing vocational training, basic accounting, and basic legal education for the children of employees and for families of former subcontractors who had been forced out of the industry by fraudulent contracts. Attached was a list of 47 households, with the amount of restitution owed to each one. The first name on the list was Ray Vance. "What do you want from me?" "Your judgment," Philip said. "Not your obedience. It took me 8 months to understand that they aren't the same thing." Winona read the entire charter, then placed it on the table. She gave him 4 conditions. The fund had to be completely financially independent, funded in one full allocation rather than through yearly contributions. She would have complete authority to hire and dismiss staff. Her name couldn't appear in any family announcement, and she would keep this evening class exactly where it was, without relocating it. Philip agreed to all 4 conditions. In November of the following year, the Vance Foundation opened in Red Hook inside a renovated warehouse. There were no reporters. Helen Marsh cut the ribbon because Winona said that anyone who had served that house for 30 years deserved the honor more than anyone else. Leo Rayner, 8 years old, ran around the courtyard with his inhaler in his coat pocket while his father stood in the doorway watching him. That evening, Philip found Winona on the rear steps. He didn't kneel. He simply held out his grandmother's old ring. "The first time, I asked because you saved me," he said. "This time, I'm asking because I finally understand that the person being tested throughout those 3 days wasn't you." Winona looked at the ring. "I keep the foundation. Of course. I keep the class. Of course. And when I disagree with you, I expect that will happen often." She smiled. "Then yes, Philip. The ring of brass keys now hangs in the reception room of the Vance Foundation, beneath a small plaque engraved with the words, 'No one should be judged by the title they carry.'" This story leaves us with several very simple truths. A person's worth isn't found in the title they wear, but in what they choose to do when no one requires it of them, and no one is watching. Power isn't as dangerous as the habit of believing only those who hold the official seal, because the truth is so often spoken by the person with the least authority to speak, and that is precisely why it is ignored. True kindness doesn't need recognition in order to exist, just as Winona returned when she had nothing left to gain. And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means transforming your pain into something that prevents the same harm from reaching the next person. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so that together we can continue listening to more meaningful stories every day. How did Winona's story make you feel? And have you ever known someone in your own life who was looked down upon, yet continued to show quiet kindness? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.